I took a knife for John. And had one ovary removed. On the day of his wedding. John promised me. That we would be dinks for life. But 10 years later. He regretted it. After drinking. John vented to his friends. Although I don't want children either. But not wanting to have children is one thing. Not being able to is another. What kind of woman doesn't want to have children? Later. He accompanied the boss of the noodle shop to her prenatal checkups. John explained to me. Don't worry. She never wanted to interfere in our marriage. I just need a child. I didn't question it. After the divorce. I went to Monaco. Until a year later. I posted a set of 6-month pregnant photos on my circle of friends. John was haggard. And limping. And finally found me. I stroked my belly. And laughed. Natural selection. The strong tadpoles will choose for themselves. Yours are too weak. Today is my annual medical examination day. Jenny. Although one side of your ovary has been removed. It doesn't mean you can't have children. Why don't you try? The attending obstetrician and gynecologist. Mary. Is my best friend. She took the medical report I just got from the checkup. And persuaded me. I shook my head. And said it's up to fate. John said it didn't matter to him whether we had kids or not. 10 years ago. On our honeymoon. I accidentally took a knife for John. And had one of my ovaries removed. John felt guilty. And vowed to be a lifelong dink. It so happened. That I didn't want to have kids anyway. So never had children. After chatting with Mary for a while. I got up and walked out. Unexpectedly. I stopped after a few steps. At the end of the corridor. A well-dressed man was carefully supporting a woman. The woman was pregnant. It looked like she was in her 6th or 7th month. A happy smile was on her plump face. And I could see clearly. That the woman was John's wife. The owner of the noodle restaurant next to his company. She was walking with the elegant and handsome man next to her. This scene. Seemed extremely strange. I looked at the two of them. Who were getting closer and closer. In a daze. Until the man on the opposite side saw me. I called out softly. John. The woman next to him looked a little flustered. She held the man's hand tightly. Dropped her head. And tried to hide behind the man. John looked up at me in surprise. People of all kinds were weaving through the hospital corridors. But I felt like time had come to a standstill. It was as if a huge stone had fallen on my chest. It was suffocating. I don't know where I found the courage. To slowly walk up to them. John's face became calm. He was the first to interrupt me. Jenny. Can we talk about this later? I sneered. Now you don't even bother to explain. John frowned. But gently patted the woman next to him on the shoulder. And pulled me aside. Don't make a scene. Linda is pregnant. And can't be upset. She can't be upset. But I can be upset. I took a deep breath. I couldn't hold back any longer. Cheating in marriage and having an illegitimate child. John. You're really something. A flash of anger crossed John's eyes. Lowering his voice. Jenny. I know I'm at fault for this. But it's already happened. The child is also innocent. Linda. With her round belly. Smiled lovingly. Jenny. You don't need to be angry. Even with this child. I will not interfere with your marriage. John frowned. Jenny. I know you can't have children. With this child. The pressure on you and me will not be so great. I always knew. John's parents had. Some reservations about the fact that I could not have children. Behind their backs. They often. Talked about me in front of relatives as. A hen that could not lay eggs. Some time ago. I thought about going with John for a test tube. But he kept pushing himself as busy. I sneered. It turned out. He was busy having children with other women. I didn't want to say anything more. I took off the ring on my ring finger in front of John. And threw it in his face. John. You were the one who didn't want children in the first place. And now you're the one who's cheating on your wife and having someone else's children. Let's get a divorce. I turned around and walked away. John grabbed my hand. With a solemn face. I didn't want a divorce with you. Can you stop messing around? Linda suddenly turned pale. And bent over. John. My stomach. My stomach doesn't feel well. John's grip on my hand suddenly loosened. He looked grave as he put his arms around Linda's waist. Linda. Hang on. I'll take you to the doctor. He looked at me. His eyes full of reproach. Jenny. If anything happens to the baby, I won't forgive you. As he shouted, doctors and nurses gathered around. Suddenly I was pushed out of the crowd. I could hear Linda's weak voice from inside. John. I'm to blame for this. I shouldn't have made things difficult for you. Linda, what are you talking about? Right now, you and the baby are the most important. Watching all this, I had indescribable feelings. It felt like snake ball churning in my stomach. So bitter it was unbearable. Walking out of the hospital, my legs instantly went weak. Leaning against a nearby pillar, my eyes welled up. And somehow I started to choke. Although John and I were married into the family, in the end, even a dog can be attached to. Not to mention the 10 years we've spent together. To say I have no feelings for him would be a lie. Once upon a time, after a drunken night, I heard him complain to a friend. Although I didn't want children either. There's a difference between not wanting to have children and being unable to have children. What kind of woman doesn't want to have children? Maybe there were problems in my marriage with him a long time ago. I just never took them seriously. I came home in a daze. And then wrote the divorce agreement. The hands of the alarm clock on the wall pointed to the dot. And the sound of the electronic lock rang at the door. John came to the kitchen as if no one was there and poured a glass of water. Since you're back, sign the divorce agreement. Let's part on good terms. I thought I would choke. But the sound that came from my throat was even calmer than I had imagined. John paused in the act of drinking. And then placed the glass heavily on the table. Jenny. Do you have to make such a scene? I didn't say a word. I just looked at him quietly. Until John's expression became uncomfortable. He snatched the pen from my hand. And simply signed the agreement. I gathered my things. And will see you at the Civil Affairs Bureau tomorrow. That night, I slept in the guest room. In the middle of the night, I tossed and turned. Unable to sleep, I got up and went to the balcony. I happened to see John smoking there. He was blowing smoke rings while talking on the phone with someone. Jenny is just a childish girl. She doesn't think about the consequences of her actions. If you say she'll leave me, who else will want her? Over the years, everyone on our side knows she can't bear children. What do I have to fear? I'd like to see when she'll come begging after we're divorced. I tightened my grip on the doorknob and let go. I don't know how long I stood there. I turned around and left. The next day, John and I arrived at the Civil Affairs office. Before entering, John glanced at me. It's not too late to regret it. No need. I'm in a hurry. I didn't even look at him. And stepped into the hall first. The staff told us it would take a month to get the certificate. I nodded. But I hadn't even left the door when John grabbed me. Jenny. There's still a 1-month cooling off period. Think about it. After all, we've been husband and wife for so many years. It would be a pity to get divorced. No need. Foxes only have one mate for life. I brushed his hand away. Sometimes people are even worse than animals. John's face suddenly turned pale. He looked like he was about to laugh in anger. Fine. Let's get a divorce. Who's afraid of whom? John and I parted ways. A month later, I successfully received the Red Book. When I arrived at the bar, I ordered a Bloody Mary. To myself, I took the glass and clinked it with the glass on the table. Happy divorce. The more I drank, before I knew it, I was cursing John's heartlessness. You dog. I took a knife for you. And you still said I couldn't have kids. I don't know how long it was. I was in a daze when a pair of men's leather shoes appeared before my eyes. I've drunk so much. I'm not afraid of getting drunk. My eyes are misty. I slowly looked up. Our eyes met. But I froze. Little uncle. Why? Did you leave me? Just to marry this kind of person. Thomas reached out to me. The moment he touched the corner of my eye, I subconsciously moved back. Already left. He smiled awkwardly. It's fine. I just happened to see you. Excuse me. Thomas turned to leave. I don't know why. I inexplicably grabbed his jacket. Thomas. Take me away. A sigh came from overhead. The next second I was embraced in a broad arm. A muffled voice came from my ear. Follow me. Are you sure? My body gradually relaxed. My head in Thomas's arms nodded. The little things about men and women. We have always had an understanding. Thomas was my grandfather's adopted son. About the same age as me. An unruly motorcycle girl. Who constantly teased the aloof science nerd. Under the secretion of adolescent hormones and dopamine. We fell madly in love. But the first person to give in to family opposition was me. I was forced to break up with Thomas. And choose to go on a blind date with John. Thomas. In order to keep me. Stood in the rain in front of the house all night. In order to make him give up. I lied to him. Thomas. You are my uncle. I respect you. And love you. But this is not the kind of relationship a woman has with a man. It's just a junior to an elder. Thomas left in a daze. And went abroad ever since. To be honest. I haven't seen him for many years. When I was taken to the villa. I learned for the first time that Thomas had also bought a property in China after returning to the country. When we met again. I couldn't tell what kind of emotion I felt. I stood there a little awkwardly. Thomas poured a glass of water. And gulped it down. Do you want some water? I shook my head. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Unbuttoned the top button of his shirt. And with long, slender fingers undid his tie. Before. To my surprise. He put his arms around my waist. A strange yet familiar scent. Poured into my nostrils. I squirmed a little. Feeling awkward. He whispered in my ear. I'm afraid you'll get thirsty later. Thomas was so aggressive. I had no choice but to submit. His large hands caused a wave of heat to rise in my skin. Before I knew it, we were on the sofa. Bastard. Be gentle. His unbridled manner startled me. So obedient. Not like you. Thomas simply took off his tie and tied my hands. I couldn't help it. I've been holding back for 10 years. The man's voice was hoarse with restraint. I was dazed. I don't know how long it lasted. All I know is that the sky outside the house changed from day to night. And from night to day. My throat was so dry it was about to burst. I pushed Thomas weakly. Get up. In the meantime. My phone rang countless times. When I saw it was John calling. I froze for a moment. But a big hand took the phone away from me before I could turn it off. When I turned it on again. It was after midnight. The phone was full of missed calls from John. And messages from him. I didn't answer the phone until he called the next time. I heard John's annoyed voice on the line. Jenny. Where are you? Why aren't you answering my calls? We're divorced. Why should I answer your calls? John paused for a moment on the other end of the line. Then raised his voice. I haven't announced it to the world yet. But we're still married. Besides. My mother is getting on in years and can't handle any more excitement. Today's her birthday dinner. You must come. Before I could say anything. The line was hastily hung up. If John hadn't called. I would have forgotten. It was his fucking birthday. John's mother had no other hobbies. But a passion for ostentation. Even her birthday had to be celebrated in a 5-star hotel. She was always picking on me. Even though John and I had decided not to have children. She went around saying that I was a chicken that couldn't lay eggs. My fingers twitched slightly. As I prepared to block the number of the Roberts. Suddenly. I felt a strong gaze fall upon me. I looked up. And saw Thomas propping his chin up. With one hand. Raising one eyebrow at me. His eyes were lazy. But there was a hint of tension hidden within. I suddenly had an idea. I got up without saying a word and tidied myself up. As I walked. I felt the wound. And couldn't help but blurt out. Thomas. You're eating people alive. After last night's scene. Thomas didn't say a word. And walked silently behind me. With his arms spread. Around my body. You're not bad yourself. You're a dog. Then he said. Pointing at the fingernail marks on his neck and back. I coughed. I don't care. You've hurt me. And now you have to make amends. What? John's mother's birthday banquet. You'll go with me. Thomas then smiled. What? You're going to introduce me to someone? I defiantly stroked his skin. With a hint of flirtatiousness. Sure. I'm tired of being a good wife and mother. It's nice to be a biker girl again. Thomas froze. He obviously didn't expect me to say that. A year ago, I gave up on the relationship between Thomas and me. And entered a marriage of silence. Was it right or wrong to marry John? I no longer wanted to think about it. The only thing I could do was perhaps seize the last bit of opportunity in life. And live the way I was supposed to. Opening the carport. I found a brand new motorcycle. Leather jacket. Leather skirt. Smoky makeup. The roar of the engine. It was as if all this brought me back years ago. Thomas put on a leather jacket. Sat behind me. And before he stepped on the gas, Thomas said something. Take it easy. I'm an old man. The Ritz Hotel. The moment we pushed open the door to the private room, everyone looked at Thomas and me. The scene that should have been full of toasts and laughter suddenly fell silent. John's mother looked at me with a glass of champagne in her hand. Her face expressionless. The fat on her face trembled slightly. The lines on her red lips became more and more distinct. John suddenly rose to his feet with a gloomy face. What a sight. Jenny. He walked up quickly. And whispered. Why are you dressed like that? John reached out to grab my dress. But was stopped by a big hand. John locked eyes with Thomas. For a moment. Shocked and angry. Jenny. Who is this guy? I laughed. Let me introduce. This is my new boyfriend Thomas. Suddenly. The discussion in the private room erupted. What's going on? The Robert family's daughter-in-law has brought a boyfriend. Did I hear that right? I thought we were just having dinner. I didn't expect to see this kind of show. I'm afraid the Robert family boy's head is glowing green. Grandma Goo is furious. Haha. I raised my eyebrows slightly. It seems I don't need to say anything. These people are spitting out words. And they're about to make the good-mannered John's mother die of anger. You unfaithful thing. John's mother leaned on her cane. And pointed at me and cursed. Her face twitched violently. And white powder puffed. Falling down. In a somewhat comical manner. Jenny. What are you doing? John's forehead veins bulged. And his nostrils kept flaring. He supported the fainting John's mother. And angrily said to me. Jenny. You came anyway. Why do you have to do this? My mother. Why? You have a mistress to help you give birth to children. I can't bring a boyfriend. I raised my voice. So that everyone present could hear clearly. I'll ask you what's the fuss about. We're divorced. I'm here today to give your mother face. Not you. The voices in the private room grew louder. What? Illegitimate child. Divorced. John's mother almost fainted on the spot. You. John was so angry that he couldn't catch his breath. Jenny. I love you. But you can't give birth. What can I do? I said coldly. Don't forget how I had my ovaries removed in the first place. Don't make excuses for cheating on your wife. He blushed and reddened. Pointing at me. Like a cock with its neck pinched. Thomas looked up and down at John. With displeasure in his eyes. What? Is your ex-husband doing meddling? Thomas's smile turned sour. When John grabbed his shirt. The buttons came off. Revealing a red mark around his neck. Anyone could see what it was. John's hands trembled with anger. His eyes were like knives. Jenny. What is this? Thomas, who had been grabbed, looked calm. He glanced at me. And gave me. Look what you do with it look. Fine. I'll just watch from the sidelines. I ignored John's whole face. Which was green and purple. And smiled flirtatiously at Thomas. You bastard. Last night you did this and that. I have to punish you a little. Thomas's ears suddenly turned red. His eyes wandered. He raised his right hand. Curled it around his lips. And coughed. When John saw this. His face turned white and red. Son of a bitch. He raised his fist and smashed it into Thomas's face. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Without even moving his body. And just tilted his head lightly. His left foot slightly raised. John's foot suddenly stumbled. In the blink of an eye, he fell to the ground. And fell on his face. There was a gasp in the box. John wailed, accompanied by loud cursing. Thomas gave a slight smile. And gave me a. I looked back at him with a little laugh. Things that get physical naturally could not be trivial. Several relatives of the Robert family rushed up with anger. Run. Thomas lifted his clothes, grabbed my hand, and sprinted outside. The moment the key engine car started, Thomas wrapped his arms tightly around my waist. The wind whistled past my ears. I quickly left those people behind and parked the car in a secluded park. The moment I turned my head, I met Thomas's gaze. Childish. I couldn't help but laugh. But it was Thomas who laughed first. Then I followed suit and let out a laugh. It seemed that at this moment, we were back 10 years ago. Suddenly, Thomas pulled something out of his pocket. The diamond on the ring sparkled in the sunlight. Will you marry me? Thomas got down on one knee. His face was tense. We've already missed 10 years. I don't want to miss the next 10 years. I slowly hid my smile and began to carefully examine the expression on Thomas's face until I didn't find the slightest hint of a joke. I reached out for the ring. And then, with Thomas's puzzled gaze, I closed the lid. You know, Thomas, I don't want to get married. Not to mention the fact that the probability of me having a child is very low. As I spoke, my voice grew lower and lower. I even felt a little afraid to look into Thomas's eyes. You want a free ride? Cough cough. I almost choked on my own saliva. I don't care. Thomas got up and pulled me close to him. I'm yours now. You have to take responsibility for me. I couldn't help but twitch at the corner of my mouth. Thomas is afraid he's not crazy. But who knew? He lightly raised the corner of his mouth. Don't look at me like that. I'm not crazy or sick. Why? Are you interested in going to Monaco with me? My heart skipped a beat. It's possible. For the time being. I didn't want to deal with the entanglements between my family and Robert's family. After getting the visa and getting on the plane, I realized with hindsight that Thomas was probably trying to abduct me. After arriving in Nice, France, Thomas told me about some of his experiences. Over the years, he settled in Fontvieille and became a professor and bought a fixed property. After several hours of traveling, we finally arrived at Thomas's house. I fell asleep. When I woke up, I received countless missed calls from my parents. And a message. Jenny, you can't have children anyway. You don't know anything. Mom knows you're angry. But if you divorce for no reason, aren't you just giving that woman more of a chance? I heard that Linda has moved into your house. I turned on the surveillance camera at home. Sure enough, I saw Linda, pregnant and busy in the kitchen. John thoughtfully wiped the sweat off her forehead with a tissue. His gentle voice came from inside. Linda, the noodles you cooked are delicious. Jenny can't cook anything. I have to cook for myself every day after work. After saying that, he seemed to glance at the surveillance camera above his head. I was stunned for a moment. And then came back to my senses. I was a little overwhelmed with laughter. After we got married, John said he felt sorry for me and didn't want me to cook. I married a wife, not hired a nanny. You don't have to cook for me in the future. At that time, I thought John was a man with a very positive outlook on life. Now I think about it. Either he was just a good pretender, or the past 10 years have worn off his previous guilt towards me and his fidelity to our marriage. John wants to use this method to make me jealous and force me to come back. Isn't this too childish? Or is he confident enough to think that I love him to death? The sofa underneath him was soft. Thomas sat down. He glanced at my phone. Why? Do you regret it? I shook my head with a smile. Just watching the fun. Thomas watched the surveillance video with interest. In the camera, Linda gently fed John spaghetti and tenderly wiped his mouth. I heard Thomas's voice in my ear. Your ex-husband seems to be really hungry. I thought he would at least find someone younger if he cheated. I didn't expect him to find a MILF. Didn't you know? I gave Thomas a slightly amused look. You men take in the best income, pay the average labor, and enjoy the average sex. When he is horny, he can be infinitely compatible. Who said that? Thomas was a little unconvinced. I randomly picked a few important videos and sent them to the lawyer. While I was doing this, Thomas took the phone out of my hand. I looked at him in puzzlement. What are you doing? Since we got off the plane, you haven't even looked at me properly. Thomas pinched my face and said something about being aggrieved. I couldn't help but burst out laughing. Thomas, can you stop being so childish? The next second, I felt my body lift off the ground. Thomas picked me up in his arms. My slightly messy hair brushed my eyebrows and eyes. Thomas's voice, muffled with suppressed emotion, whispered in my ear. There are even more childish things. Let go of me. I'm jet-lagged. I heard that before. Jet lag. Exercise can slow down aging. That night, Thomas was exceptionally clingy. Until I was sweating profusely and panting heavily. He still didn't let go of me. In the days that followed, whenever Thomas was free, he took me everywhere. Along the stunning coastline of southern France, the Alps jut out a steep corner, snuggled against the Mediterranean. Cars, yachts, palaces. It was like being in a fairy tale. Thomas treated me like a princess. He booked me a table at a restaurant that was impossible to get into. When the lobster pasta arrived, I suddenly felt a wave of nausea in my stomach. Fortunately, the feeling passed quickly. When I got home that evening, I got a call from Mary. Jenny, I heard all about you and Thomas. Well done. She sounded suddenly excited on the other end of the line. You know what? John and the other woman's baby was born. And guess what? The child has genetic defects. I was about to say something when an uncontrollable feeling of nausea rose from my stomach. I couldn't help it. I put down the phone and vomited into the toilet. When I picked up the phone again, Mary on the other end asked anxiously, Jenny, are you pregnant? I stared with wide eyes. My head was buzzing. Pregnant? How could that be? Although Thomas and I hadn't used protection on so many occasions, I had had one fallopian tube removed. How could I get pregnant so easily? Otherwise, John and I would have had a child. Long ago. When Thomas found out, he hurriedly made an appointment for a hospital checkup. The moment I got the report, I was really dumbfounded. Feeling my small, not yet visible belly. I really didn't expect to be a mother in this life. Strangely, Thomas wasn't very happy. He sat in the hallway, playing with the lighter in his hands. The flame flickered, and the same light shone in his eyes, which were dark and hard to discern. He saw me come out of the blood-drawing room, and got up to embrace my body, and rested his head on my neck. With a baby, will you no longer want to be with me? Will you no longer put me first? I froze for a moment, and couldn't help but laugh. What are you talking about? You're such a child. I left him, and walked on. Thomas chased after me. Why are you running? Wait for me. I had planned to go back to Monaco after a few days. Who knew? I would become pregnant. At Thomas's persuasion, I decided to give birth in Monaco. When I was in my 6th month of pregnancy, I posted a set of pregnancy photos on WeChat. Unexpectedly, one day a few months later, the door of Thomas's house was knocked on. The jingling doorbell sounded particularly urgent. When I opened the door, I unexpectedly saw the haggard face of John. John looked much thinner and darker. His clothes were a bit messy, and his pants had a hole in the hem. In the past, this would never have happened to the clean and tidy John. There was a light layer of grayish dust under his eyes, and slightly greasy hair sticking to his face. What are you doing here? John licked the corner of his dry mouth, and his eyes turned red. Jenny, I finally found you. Suddenly, his face turned pale, and he fell backwards. It so happened that Thomas had just returned from school. He must have had low blood sugar. I sighed helplessly, and told Thomas to get him inside first, and do whatever he wanted. Thomas snorted, and said he didn't want to get involved either. But you should remember that my family still has business dealings with the Roberts. If he dies in front of me, I can't guarantee that they won't come looking for trouble. Perhaps it was because my family had previously forced me to separate from him and marry John. That Thomas's face was cold as he left John on the sofa and rudely poured a cup of sweetened water into his mouth. John woke up. Or should I say, he was woken up by the choking. Once he woke up, he should have left early. Thomas's face was gloomy, and his expression was not good. But John ignored him. He just looked straight at me, with pursed pale lips. Jenny, will you go back with me? I know I was wrong. Hearing these words, Thomas exploded first. Get out of here. John stood up and angrily grabbed Thomas by the collar. Jenny is my wife. You, the man I'm cheating on. Get out of here. We've already divorced. You scumbag. Thomas refused to back down. I stood up. The blanket on my clothes slipped, revealing my round belly. Thomas stopped arguing and reached over to help me. For a moment, the air froze. John's eyes widened, and he pointed at my belly, stammering. You're pregnant. I touched my belly. Natural selection. The strong tadpoles will choose for themselves. Yours are too weak. John's mouth opened slightly. His eyes popped. His face suddenly turned even paler. I was a little puzzled. Yes. I posted it on WeChat a month ago. You didn't see it. John slowly closed his eyes and just stood there quietly. The corners of his lips were bitten until they were bloodless. When he opened his eyes again, his eyes were bloodshot. After you left, I regretted it. 2 months ago, I went abroad to look for you. From what John told me, I roughly got an idea of what he had been through these days. After I left, he had originally thought about just living with Linda. But who knew? The child born to them had genetic defects. Its skin was extremely fragile. Exposed to sunlight, or the cold wind, or even a touch, it would develop large blisters. Not only on the outside, but also on the mucous membranes inside the body. It could be said, the child was sentenced to death from birth. Later, after some investigation, they found out that Linda had this family gene. Her sister died at a young age due to this genetic disease. But she kept it a secret from John. After learning about it, John regretted it and wanted to break up with her. But Linda wouldn't let go. After learning where I was, John decided to come to Monaco to find me and avoid Linda's harassment. But as soon as he got off the plane, he was mugged and nice. His luggage, wallet, phone, and passport were all taken. At his lowest point, he even had to pick through the trash for leftovers to eat. When he talked about his grievances, John's eyes even brimmed with tears. I then noticed that his left leg was lame. Upon asking, I learned that he had accidentally fallen into a human organ trafficking organization. This leg was accidentally broken while escaping. Later, with the help of a Chinese benefactor, he managed to find out about me after many twists and turns. John spoke with a tearful voice. And deserved it. Thomas hugged me and looked at John coldly. So I really know I was wrong. John suddenly came forward and grabbed my hand. I plan to chase after you again. I will also treat the child in your belly as my own. Is that okay? Forgive me. Bang. Before John could finish speaking, he took a punch from Thomas. The huge impact caused John to fall to the ground. John, who was already weak, took a long time to stagger to his feet. He wiped the blood from his nose. He was shocked and angry. He reacted by trying to punch Thomas. Stop. I looked at John coldly. I'm not going with you. You've forgotten how you cheated on Linda. You betrayed our marriage first. And now you're back to me because the child born to your mistress is not okay. You regret not our marriage at all. But you regret having a mistress like Linda. Facing my outburst, John was speechless. He covered his head and slowly slid to the ground. Then suppressed sobs came from his mouth. John bit his wrist hard until blood flowed. If you want to cry or die, go away. Thomas frowned. He picked him up and pushed him out the door. Don't come here again. From outside the door came John's unwilling knocking. "Jenny. I won't give up. I know I was wrong. But I'll change." He knocked for a long time. Until Thomas called the security guard to throw him out. He took out the cigarette in his pocket a little irritably. It seemed that he suddenly remembered that I was pregnant. He twisted his thumb. And then he directly rubbed the cigarette into a ball. And threw it into the trash can. I reached around from behind. And stroked his shoulder. "Why are you so irritated?" Thomas sighed. And turned to hug me. His voice was a little dull. "That son of a bitch. Will use a ruse of self-harm. What a vicious mind." I rubbed his hair. And laughed. "Don't worry. I don't feel anything for him now. And I'm your wife now. No hatred. And no grief. I just treat him like a stranger. Maybe. This is what Buddhism calls letting go." When I returned to China. It was already 6 months later. Thomas took advantage of the summer vacation to take me back to see my parents. We had already gotten married in Monaco. So it didn't matter if we went back or not. But Thomas was anxious. "No way. If you don't take me back. It's like you're not giving me a title." It turned out. Thomas had been concerned about the fact that we hadn't gotten married in China. I nodded. It was time to go home. My parents were waiting at the airport. When we arrived. They had seen that Thomas and I were already married. They had to make peace with it. Their smiles were a little stiff. Soon. The two of them were captivated by their adorable child. But the next night. A familiar figure appeared at the entrance to my house. John was holding flowers. And standing in front of my house. His hair was slicked back with gel. And even the strands were combed back. He was dressed sharply. And his shoes were polished to a shine. "Jenny. It's me. I know you're back in the country." John slammed the front door. We were all having dinner as a family. But now. Thomas sprang up. And rushed to the door. I hurriedly stopped him. "Thomas. What's your hurry? He can't come back in. You're usually so calm. Why are you acting so impulsively?" Thomas's face was not looking good. "How can I stay calm when it's about you? This guy must have eaten some honey. After getting married. His mouth got sweeter and sweeter every day." Outside. John saw that no one was moving inside. So he started to raise his voice again. "Jenny. I know. I'm an asshole. I let you down and betrayed your trust and feelings. I made a mistake. I deserve to die. But this mistake also made me realize. I can't live without you. Your presence has been fused into my bones. You were once like a star that lit up my life. But I never believed it was real. Time and time again I took it down and smashed it. And then. The star shattered. And you left me. But if you could give me another chance. I would never let go of your hand. Get out." Thomas couldn't hold back any longer. And let out a roar. The veins on his neck bulged. If not for a glimmer of reason restraining him. Thomas would have killed John. "I'm not in a position to ask for your forgiveness. But it's always possible to give me a chance to pursue you. Isn't it?" John was still rambling outside the door. "My home is in a villa-style community. Although there are not many residents. But after all. In a community. It quickly attracted the attention of residents in the community. "John. Don't do that kind of thing to chase your wife. Your actions and words. Have no meaning in my eyes." I opened the door. And quickly closed it after saying this. The sky was covered with dark clouds. And soon there was a thunderstorm. John kept standing in the same place. The flowers were destroyed by the heavy rain. And their petals were scattered all over the ground. "I will not give up. Jenny. I will show you my determination." I shrugged helplessly. And took Thomas to the room to watch TV. Mom and Dad glanced at each other. And shook their heads. They simply drew the curtains. Out of sight. As I watched. Thomas and I fell asleep without knowing it. The next morning. I saw John. Soaked to the skin. Lying in front of my door. Pale and feverish. Thomas gave a. John was quickly taken away by ambulance. According to my parents. John almost developed pneumonia from the fever. Who knew that after a few days. John would come back to the neighborhood causing trouble. And Thomas and I had no choice. But to move to a hotel. Who knew? John somehow found out where we were and tracked us down to the hotel and booked a room right across from ours. In the following days, room service brought more flowers and champagne, and either a card or some other little surprise he thought we would like. This really angered Thomas. I don't care. This week, we'll go to the civil affairs office to get our marriage certificate. A week later, finally, Thomas and I arrived at the civil affairs bureau and got married. In front of the civil affairs bureau, Thomas looked at me a little nervously. Jenny, look. My tie isn't crooked. Is it? Is my hair too messy? Oh right. Did you bring everything? I couldn't help laughing. Why are you so nervous? Thomas gave me a glare. It's natural to be nervous the first time you get married. I squeezed his waist and said, pretending to be angry. What? You want a second time? No. Thomas frowned. His face turned a little pale. Wait. I'm so nervous I need to go to the bathroom. I watched Thomas's flustered back as he hurried away. I shook my head. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. Jenny. John came up to me at some point. Don't marry him. Can you think about it again? I was shocked by him. Frowning, he said, will you marry me? Then, John took out a ring and held flowers in one hand. As he knelt on one knee, the crowd was confused and started to hoot. Marry him. Marry him. Marry him. John the lunatic had gone crazy again. I raised my hand and knocked his ring off. John. What's wrong with you? Thomas and I got married in Monaco. We even had a child. The people around us were embarrassed and fell silent. You cheated on me during our marriage. We got a divorce. Now I'm starting a new life. And you're here to bother me again. I'm shaking with anger. You can't get your way in this world. Facing the murmuring crowd, John looked calm. I know you still love me. You just can't let go of me. You're only with Thomas because you have a child. You have to be together. You're crazy. I looked at my watch with some impatience. Thomas should be here soon. Right. I didn't want to pay any attention to John. But then a fat body rushed up from a distance. Linda was even fatter after giving birth. Her face was painted whiter than a wall. Red lipstick was painted on the corners of her mouth. She picked up the diamond ring on the ground and put it on her hand. John. Is this the ring you bought for me? John frowned. His eyes were full of disgust. Give me back the ring. This is not your property. He reached out to grab the ring, but was instead embraced by Linda. I know. You're angry about Debao. But it's okay. I can still have more children. No, you can have as many children as you want. John. Don't ignore me. I know you got a divorce so you could be with me. I'm sorry. Linda gave me a smug glance. I've even booked the wedding dress. John finally pushed Linda away and avoided her like the plague. He took a few hasty steps back. I'm warning you. I have nothing to do with you. If you hadn't seduced me and bring me meals every day, how could I have fallen for you? If it wasn't for the fact that you're a good provider, do you think I'd be with you? Compared to Jenny, you're miles behind. Who do you think you are to stand next to me? Linda's expression became distorted. She grabbed John's hand and kept tugging. How can you say that I gave you a daughter? John slapped her without any hesitation and yelled. How dare you mention the child? If it weren't for your genetic disease, I wouldn't have let you give birth. Linda covered her face. Her eyes filled with tears. Her face was a mixture of grievance, sadness and disappointment. All emotions finally exploded at this moment. You said your wife can't even cook noodles. I feel very sorry for you, so I cooked noodles every day and gave them to you. You said your wife is not considerate at all. I don't know how hard you work. You said your wife can't give birth. And she can't make you happy. There is no longer any affection between you. Linda's neck veins bulged. It's obvious that you provoked me first. Is it her? She is trying to drive a wedge between us. Seeing Linda suddenly turn on me, I felt baffled. She looked ferocious. You woman. Why did you come back after you left? Her hand was about to slap me in the face. At the critical moment, Thomas arrived and kicked her in the knee. Linda let out a cry and fell to the ground. I nervously pulled Thomas. Thomas circled around me and looked down at Linda from a position of superiority. Get away from me. Linda scrambled to her feet. Don't get too cocky. John is mine. And turns to John, lunging at him. John tries to avoid her, but the crowd behind him blocks his way. Linda is extremely strong, and she holds John back as she walks out. John. I know you love me. Let's go home. Ugh. Let go of me. Ugh. John is caught by her strong arms around his neck. The suffocating feeling makes him blush. Some people in the crowd even recognize John and take out their phones to take pictures. That's it. John is held hostage by Linda and walks further and further away. Let's go. Let's go home. The next day, the city's TV station reported a suicide and homicide. The protagonists were John and Linda. I heard that Linda tied John up at home and then turned on the gas tank. Both died, along with the baby under 1 year old. According to investigators, when John died, he tried to break free from the ropes and struggled desperately. The body was last seen in the living room a few meters from the door. My parents were a little saddened with the existence of the child. They no longer opposed Thomas and I. With John dead like this, the Robert family's wealth and company were almost entirely divided up among his cousins. The Robert family, having lost John, was like a headless chicken. I knew that the Robert family home had once been mortgaged by John. So now Gu's parents, John and his mother, had become displaced elderly people. They begged my parents to take them in. After all, we had also been in-laws before. John's mother spoke with tears in her eyes, while my parents kept quiet. After all, it wasn't John who had disliked me for not being able to bear children for so many years, and made things difficult for me everywhere. My family may not be as wealthy as the Robert family, but we are not poor either. What in-laws? We have long since divorced. Besides, we have our own son-in-law. Besides, if your son hadn't gotten himself into trouble and got himself killed, would you have ended up in this situation? Without any hesitation, my parents kicked these two out of the house. John's mother kept cursing and swearing, but it was all in vain. On the plane back to Monaco, I patted the baby in my arms and felt an immense sense of happiness. The end.